Election Commission, a commission that was established just like our Ethics Commission, Mr. President, in the Senate, with an equal number of one party and no imbalance. This politicizes the Federal Election Commission. It makes it a partisan agency, not a bipartisan policing agency. It pours federal funds into campaigns, and it chills free speech. Bad policy, I think, Mr. President, in search of a problem. Now, Democrats have said this is necessary to increase voting rights, particularly for minorities, but the overall turnout in the year 2000 was about 2/3 of all the voters, the highest percentage of voters that participated in over a century. So what we have here is an election that had the highest level of participation in over a century. Most states had their highest voter turnout in 40 years, and we decide we need to change the system. S1 isn't just about bad policy, it's about what Democrats have seen as a political imperative. Now, frankly, this has been the bill that Democrats have offered for about the last 20 years. It varies a little bit from time to time, but about 20 years ago, and maybe before that, I was a chief election official in our state at that time. I don't remember Democrats offering this before 20 years ago, but starting about 2 decades ago, every couple of years, and certainly every time Democrats get a majority in the House, they pass this bill or one almost exactly like it. When asked about what it would take to maintain the current majority in the House, Speaker Pelosi said, well, we'd be better if we could pass H.R. 1 and S1. That sounds like she thinks there is a political advantage there, and I respect the Speaker's political judgment and always have respected Speaker Pelosi's political judgment. Her judgment would be that this would be better for Democrats than not changing the current election law. S1 is really full of unnecessary, and as it turns out, unpopular provisions. You know, under the label, would you like to vote for a bill that would secure democracy? Well, of course, who wouldn't want to be for securing democracy? Fortunately, this bill has been around long enough that people have begun to understand what's in it. Same list that's been out there before. This bill would render state voter ID laws meaningless by requiring states to allow affidavits in lieu of identification. In other words, you say who you are at the polling place. Well, anybody who's going to try to cast a ballot at the polling place they shouldn't cast, probably also likely to be willing to say that they're qualified to vote at that election. In a recent poll, a poll that came out this week, 80% of Americans supported voter ID laws. Another poll just a couple of weeks ago, national support for photo ID was 75%. That included 69% of black voters and 60% of Democrats. So we've got a principled position of this bill that 80% of all voters, at least 75% of all voters, and 60% of Democrats are for, but this bill changes that law that makes sense to almost everybody. This bill requires that unlimited ballot harvesting that I talked about just a minute ago. Now, Mr. President, the only time I recall a congressional discussion recently about ballot harvesting was last year when the House of Representatives refused to seat a Republican elected member because that campaign had used ballot harvesting. Now we have a law that requires every state not to prohibit ballot harvesting, and the risk of fraud, the risk of every ballot not getting to the place ballots need to be certainly increases when you hand them to a ballot harvester, usually somebody paid by a campaign or a party to go around and collect ballots, and someone whose motivation to get those ballots all turned in may not be everything you'd want it to be. 62% of respondents in one poll said ballot harvesting should be illegal. Another provision in this bill that clearly is not a popular provision if people begin to look at it. Now again, Voting to protect democracy, sure, that's popular, but the way this bill does it, when people look at it, it's not popular. The bill requires states to give felons the right to vote in federal elections when they're out of prison. Some states do that, some states don't. Of course, if this bill passed, every state would have the choice of going ahead and doing that or having two sets of voter rolls, one for federal elections and another one for non-federal elections. That, of course, makes no sense at all, and what this bill anticipates is that no matter what states wanted to do, this is provision that they'd have to adopt. There's another way to get that done. Go to state legislatures and explain the value of having that change if that change needs to be made. This bill restricts the ability of states to maintain accurate voter rolls. Many states with Democrat governors and Democrat secretaries of state and Democrat legislatures have worked hard to see that they had a system in place to where you would periodically check and see if the people who are registered to vote are still where they registered to vote from. Our state, I think a lot of states, if you move to another county and register to vote there, you're supposed to say as part of that process who you could notify to get you off the voter rolls, but there's no requirement that that has to happen. And a periodic check of the voter rolls was seen not too long ago as a huge protection of democracy. This makes it much harder to do, but a 2018 poll found that 77% of Americans supported this kind of voter roll maintenance. Frankly, it'd be pretty hard to come up with a bill that had so many major tenets that were so out of step with what people think the government ought to do and what they want their state government to do, and in most cases where state governments are doing this. This bill provides government funding for campaigns, $6 of federal money for every dollar raised in small donors. Now, small donors is under $200. Frankly, if you were doing this, Mr. President, there'd be the current members of the Senate under this bill could receive up to collectively $1.8 billion from the federal government to run their campaigns, to attack their challenger or whatever they want to do with their campaign money. $1.8 billion to do that. Pretty easy to qualify for this money. We saw people raise money in the first quarter of this year that would have qualified, in the case of our friend, the senator from Texas, Senator Cruz, somewhere between $25 and $30 million would go to his campaign. Now, we had a markup on this bill in the Rules Committee. Not a single member of the Rules Committee, Democrat or Republican, including Senator Cruz, thought Senator Cruz should get $24 or $25 million from the federal government for his campaign. The bill creates a partisan federal elections commission. It gets rid of that bipartisan makeup that's been there from the very start. This bill chills free speech in that it creates a disclosure document that makes it really people reluctant to give money to other groups that aren't candidates who'd like to talk about elections, and it federalizes redistricting. S1 would put in place one set of federal rules for redrawing congressional districts that have always been the role of the states. If a state wants to give that out to somebody besides the legislature, they can do that, and many states have done that. But states have been the constitutional designated place to determine how they draw congressional maps in their own state. And even if a state manages to comply with all these requirements, under this bill, the Justice Department would have to be involved. Under this bill, the court of jurisdiction in all cases on redistricting would be the federal court in Washington, D.C., not the federal court in the circuit that Missouri's in, you wouldn't even start at the district court in Kansas City or St. Louis. The federal court in Washington, D.C. would be the place you'd go, but of course the purpose of the bill is to bring all these election decisions to one place. The idea that the best decisions are always made in Washington, D.C. on all topics is an idea that most Americans don't agree with. There are things they think we can do and should do and can only do because they can't do them any other way, like defend the country and set big national priorities. But for well over 200 years now, local election officials responsible for the sense of credibility of what happens on Election Day have done this job. I think they've done it well. This bill would require states to take burdensome actions and make expensive changes in their election system. Even if the states have already adopted some of the so-called reforms, they in all likelihood have to make changes in their system to comply. So the federal takeover elections shouldn't happen. I urge my colleagues not to support it happening. The American people don't want to see the things imposed on our election system that are in this bill, and I urge my colleagues to vote against this harmful legislation. And I would yield back.
Madam President.
The Senator from Oregon.
Madam President, every day that I have the honor of coming to work in the hallowed halls of this building, a symbol to the country and to the world of America's commitment to liberty and to justice, freedom and democracy, I'm humbled. I'm humbled by the faith and responsibility that the people of Oregon have placed in me to advocate on their behalf. I'm humbled by the responsibility to exercise the power of this office, to use the opportunity to lift up all Americans, to create a foundation for families to thrive, to tackle significant challenges like human rights and global warming. But among all these responsibilities, one is the highest, which is to defend our constitutional republic. And in that Constitution, the single most important power given to every American is the right to a voice and a vote. A voice and a vote in the decisions of this government and the direction of our nation. As we saw all too clearly on January 6th, when this very building was attacked by a mob intent on burning the ballots of millions of Americans, democracy based on free and fair elections is far from guaranteed. Each generation, each new set of senators and House members has the responsibility to defend it anew. The sad truth, however, is that a violent mob storming the Capitol isn't the only way to attack our democracy. It can also be attacked by the quiet plotting of powerful and privileged individuals who hate the concept of government of, by, and for the people. And they work to undermine and corrupt the workings of our republic to produce instead government by and for the powerful. In his inaugural address, our second president, John Adams, remarked that we should be unfaithful to ourselves if we should ever lose sight of the danger to our liberties, if anything partial or extraneous should infect the purity of our free, fair, virtuous, and independent elections. Well, my friends, our democracy, our elections are being infected. Our elections are under siege from gerrymandering, which destroys the principle of equal representation. Our system is under siege from dark money, enabling billionaires and powerful corporations to buy our elections. It is under siege by state laws being passed week to week right now that target specific communities to prevent them from voting, thereby manipulating the outcome of elections. Indeed, in at least 22 laws have been enacted in 14 states since January to infect our free and fair elections, to deliberately erect barriers meant to make it harder for targeted groups of Americans to vote, to silence their voices of students and low-income Americans, of Native Americans and seniors, of Black and brown Americans who have fought too long and too hard to have their voice and their vote stolen from them, ripped from them now. We have a responsibility as United States Senators to ensure every American's freedom to vote, just as this institution sought to do more than half a century ago, when in this chamber we passed the 1965 Voting Rights Act. We have a responsibility to ensure that every American's voice is heard and that our elections reflect the will of the people. We can fulfill that responsibility by enacting national standards for voting to ensure that every American can have a say in the key decisions impacting their daily lives, a say expressed through the ballot box. That ballot box is the beating heart of our republic, and those who seek to erect barriers to citizens having access to it are committing a crime against our democracy. We have to stop that criminal action against the rights of Americans. We must create those national standards by taking up this bill, the For the People bill, debating it, and ultimately passing it to defend our Constitution. The For the People Act is comprehensive. It does popular, common sense things to put the American people back in charge of their government and their country. It sets national standards so every American has equal freedom to vote no matter where they live. In this country, if you are an American, you have the right to vote, plain and simple, full stop. It doesn't matter what your zip code is, or your income, or the color of your skin, or your religious beliefs. You have the right to vote. Many of the state laws restricting voting are designed to eliminate early voting in person or by mail, and we know exactly why. It is because the leaders in these states know how easy it is to manipulate the vote on Election Day. In these targeted communities, the state's leaders want to be able to decrease the number of polling places, reduce the hours, change the locations, put polling places in locations with limited parking, put out false information about the date of the election, and purge targeted voters from the roll of registered voters, knowing that when they show up on Election Day, it's too late to correct the error and be able to exercise their right to vote. The antidote to these horrendous, racist attacks on the freedom and right of every American to vote is early voting in person and by mail. And this act guarantees 15 days of early voting. It sets forth the opportunity to acquire an absentee ballot, to return the ballot by mail or through dedicated drop boxes. The second big goal in national standards set forth in For the People Act is to stop billionaires from buying elections. Elections in America are intended to reflect the will of the people, not the will of the powerful and privileged. Thomas Jefferson once described this as the mother principle, saying that governments are Republican only in proportion to how they embody the will of the people. If the mega wealthy can flood our campaigns with billions of dollars sent through shell companies, untraceable money, and manipulate the outcome of the elections, then Jefferson's mother principle is murdered, because the outcome serves the powerful, not the people. The For the People Act says that people should have an equal chance of being heard, and that the people listening ought to know who's actually behind those voices and those messages. It does that by creating an honest ads policy, so political ads people see online have to disclose who's paying for them. And it does that by requiring the disclosure of mega donors contributing to political campaigns. Now, if you or I give a modest donation to a campaign, that campaign has to disclose who we are. Shouldn't the same thing that's true for an average American be true for the mega donors? This standard sets that equal standard. Third, the national standards set forth in this bill restore equal representation by ending gerrymandering, the process by which we draw congressional districts to favor one party over another, and by doing so, attack the sacred principle of equal representation. This creates a lot of bias in the House of Representatives down the hall. Take Michigan. In 2012, 14, and 16, the majority of Michiganders voted for one party at every level of government, but because of gerrymandering, the other party held a decisive advantage in the State House, in the State Senate, and in the Congressional House delegation. The For the People Act defends, restores the principle of equal representation. It does it by creating independent redistricting commissions, made up equally of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. That means candidates running for office actually have to use the power of their ideas, the persuasion of their personality, not a rigged system to hold power. Finally, the standards in this bill target corruption by addressing and eliminating conflicts of interest. Public servants should serve the public, not themselves. That includes members of Congress, the administration, and for the first time ever, the Supreme Court. This bill does that by striking down outrageous and corrupt conflicts of interest, strengthening divestment requirements, saying the president and vice president have to use a blind trust or limit their personal holdings to assets that don't pose a potential conflict of interest. It slows the revolving door between public service and K Street. It requires cabinet secretaries to recuse themselves from any issues in which a previous employer or client has a financial interest. The bill requires candidates for vice president or president to disclose their tax returns to prevent hidden conflicts of interest. Creates a code of ethics for the Supreme Court, something all other federal judges already have. None of these four principles is about helping one political party over the other. In fact, the provisions I've just laid out are wildly popular among the American people. An overwhelming supermajority of Democrats, Republicans, and independents support these four principles. It's as bipartisan as you can get. Even when it's broken into its specific provisions, 3 out of 4 Americans, Democrats, Republicans, independents, say they support these reforms because they believe in the vision of government of, by, and for the people. It's in our DNA. Americans believe that dark money should not be able to flood our elections. They believe billionaires and corporations should not be able to buy elections. They believe our nation is ill-served by corrupt conflicts of interest. They believe in the vision and ideals of our We the People Republic. And this bill is meant to do just one thing: make real the promise of democracy for all Americans. But powerful special interests don't want that. It threatens their hold on power by ending the ways they've rigged the system. And so they're all about striking down this bill. Why is that? We hear how Republican leaders say that they like this rigged system. Apparently, they like dark money in campaigns helping to buy elections. Apparently, they like targeting groups of individuals to prevent them from voting, taking us back to the racist efforts that existed before 1965 Voting Rights Act. Apparently, they like gerrymandering, thinking it's a source of political power down the hall, which political scientists say it is. But should it be principle or power that we fight for here? It should be the principle and the oath of office we took to uphold the Constitution. Standing before a crowd on a November afternoon to dedicate the Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg, 4 months after that momentous battle, President Lincoln remarked that they were gathered together to not only dedicate it to the men who had fallen in battle, but to the ideal for which they gave their lives: that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Today, it is our responsibility to carry that ideal forward and to ensure that government by the people, of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the United States of America. We in this chamber must pass the For the People Act. Thank you. I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President,
Without objection.
Madam President, are we in a
Senator from
quorum
Wisconsin.
call?
We are.
I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Madam President, I come to the floor to speak in support of proceeding to debate legislation that is critical to our democracy. Legislation that is based on two simple ideas: that Americans must be able to freely choose their elected officials, and that government must be accountable to the people, not to those with the most money. These are not Democratic or Republican ideas. They are core American ideas. But for too long, these rights have been under attack, which is why we need the critical democracy reforms in the For the People Act. I'm honored to be leading this legislation with Senators Merkley and Schumer, and to have worked with my colleagues as chair of the Rules Committee, worked with my colleagues in the House and civil rights and democracy reform groups, and you, Madam President, to bring this bill forward today. The freedom to vote is fundamental to all of our freedoms. It is how Americans control their government and hold elected officials accountable. It is the bedrock of our government. It is the founding principle of our country and has stood the test of wars, of economic strife, and yes, a global pandemic. But protecting this right has not always been easy. Throughout our country's 245-year history, we've had to course correct and take action to ensure that democracy is for the people and by the people, and that it has lived up to our ideals. At the beginning of this year, we were reminded on January 6th that it is up to us to protect against threats to our democracy, to ensure that it succeeds. I still remember that moment, 3:30 in the morning, when Senator Blunt and I, and yes, Vice President Pence, walked from this chamber with the two young women with the mahogany box full of the last ballots to get over to the House to finish our jobs, so that you, Madam President, were declared the Vice President and President Biden was declared the President. That's upholding our democracy. That's doing it together, Democrats and Republicans doing our job. And what this bill is about to me, this bill is about carrying on that torch to protect our democracy. Today, the vote to begin debate on this legislation will likely get the support of all 50 Democrats. Senator Manchin, along with the rest of our caucus, has made clear to the country that standing up for the right to vote is bigger than any one person or thing. It's about us. It's about us as Americans. I deeply appreciate the work he has put into the proposal he's putting forward today, and I look forward to continuing our discussions with him. He is doing this in good faith. There are many good things in that proposal, and today we are here together to reaffirm we will not give up this fight. It is just beginning. The 2020 election showed that you can make it safer to vote while giving voters the options that work for them. If it's vote by mail, I see my colleague, Senator Smith here. Minnesota is so proud of our same-day registration. That's worked for us. It's made us #1 in voter turnout in the country time and time and time again. Many states during the pandemic took steps exactly like that, extending options for voters like safe vote by mail. And now 34 states have no excuse, vote by mail. 34 states. The result? More than nearly 160 million Americans voted, more than ever before, and in the middle of a pandemic. I still remember those voters in the primary in Wisconsin standing in makeshift garbage bags with makeshift masks over their face in the middle of a rainstorm, in the middle of a pandemic, standing in line to vote. And in an election that the Trump Department of Homeland Security declared the most secure in our history, the American people elected, yes, President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. But in the wake of that historic election, there has been a pervasive, coordinated, and overwhelming effort to undermine the freedom to vote in future elections, with over 400 bills introduced in legislators across the country. 22 laws to restrict voting have been enacted in 14 states, and 31 more bills to roll back the right to vote have passed at least one chamber of a state legislature. As Reverend Warnock put it in this chamber in his maiden speech as senator, some people don't want some people to vote. That is what's going on here. The new law in Georgia makes it harder to request mail-in ballots, drastically limits ballot drop boxes, and makes it a crime to hand water and food to voters waiting in line to cast their ballots, when in previous elections, Georgians have stood in line for up to 10 hours to vote. One of the new Montana laws ended same-day registration on Election Day after it had been in practice in the state for 15 years, with Senator Tester joining me in trying to bring this practice across when we introduced that bill across this nation. In the weeks ahead, similar bills are expected to pass in even more states, including Texas, where the governor has promised to call the legislature into special session to pass a bill to restrict voting that was blocked at the end of regular session, thanks to the heroic efforts of Democrats in the Texas state legislature that blessed us with their presence just last week. These are not empty threats. They are real efforts to disenfranchise regular Americans from voting, senior citizens, people with disabilities, people that can't stand in line for 10 hours just to wait to vote. In the face of these efforts to roll back voting rights in so many states, the For the People Act is about setting basic national standards to make sure that all voters in this country can vote legally in the way that works for them, regardless of what zip code they live in, regardless of if they live in a big city or in a suburb or out in a small town in western Minnesota. It is about reducing the power of big money in our elections by ending secret spending by billionaires and special interests. And it is about making anti-corruption reforms to ensure politicians work for the people, not for themselves. Republicans have said that this bill is designed to provide a political advantage. But as former Republican commissioner of the Federal Election Commissioner, that chair under George Bush, Trevor Potter, has said in explaining his support for this bill, and he appeared as a witness in my hearing for this bill, he said, this bill does not give power to any particular party over another. It gives power back to the voters. And giving power back to the voters is exactly what we need. There is an amplified attack on the right to vote this year, but we've seen serious efforts to restrict voting rights since the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act 8 years ago. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 that marked the cornerstone achievement for the civil rights movement and became the law because of the tireless work of people like John Lewis, who put their lives on the line to secure voting rights. 56 years later, we are still fighting that battle. At the same time, we haven't had meaningful campaign finance or ethics reform. Our democracy desperately needs the proposals in this bill. And guess what? The American people agree. Yeah, this bill is bipartisan, except right here in this place. It's bipartisan because one poll released recently found that 78% of Americans, including 63% of Republicans, support making early in-person voting available for at least 2 weeks before Election Day. That's a proposal in our original For the People. It is in the manager's amendment that we're voting on cloture on, and it is in Senator Manchin's proposal. Another poll found that 83% of likely voters support public disclosure of contributions to groups involved in elections. Also, the Disclose Act in all three proposals. And yet some of my Republican colleagues want to limit disclosures. By the way, disclosures were championed by Justice Scalia. And yet, what happened? In our committee hearing on this, our markup, Republicans filed amendment after amendment to gut those provisions of the bill. So while they may claim, my friends on the other side of the aisle, that this isn't popular, it is just not true. They claim it's not bipartisan. It is just not true. The bill contains 9 bipartisan bills, including the Honest Ads Act, which I first introduced with Senator John McCain and Senator Warner. And now Senator Lindsey Graham took up that cause. Our provision, that provision would finally hold the social media companies accountable to make sure that there are disclaimer and disclosures on political ads. The work that I've done with Senator Langford, with you, Madam President, when you were in the Senate, to make sure we have backup paper ballots. We still have 8 states that don't have backup paper ballots. That provision is in this bill. Many of the bill's provisions have already been adopted in red, blue, and purple states and have the support of governors and election officials from both parties. 21 states have same-day voter registration, including red states like Idaho, Wyoming, and Iowa. That's great, but our question should be, why don't all 50 states have it, especially when the Constitution of the United States specifically says that Congress can make and alter rules for federal elections. It is as clear as the words on the page. 20 states have automatic voter registration laws, including Alaska, Georgia, and West Virginia. 45 states allowed all voters to vote by mail in the 2020 election, and 44 states have early voting. What this bill does is to take the best of the best and puts in place minimum standards so that no matter what state you call home, you have access to the ballot box. That is why Senator Merkley has worked so hard on this legislation. That is why Senator Schumer made this bill Senate File Number 1. The bill that we are voting to advance includes changes that directly respond to concerns about implementation from both Democratic and Republican state and local officials. We heard those concerns, and the Democrats on the Rules Committee, which included Senator Warner and Senator King, we worked on that manager's amendment and made it easier for rural areas, extended the time systems, and got at their concerns. And then Senator Manchin has come up with more ideas and more things that we can do to make the bill strong. We heard from election officials that requiring states to accept mail-in ballots for too long after Election Day would delay them from certifying the results. So we shortened the window. I could go on and on and on. In good faith, we have worked to make this bill work for America. And now it is time to allow for debate on this bill. Our Republican friends on the other side of the aisle, they say this bill, this was one thing that Senator McConnell would say in the hearing, that it would cause chaos. I'd say this, chaos is a 5-hour wait to vote. senior citizens standing in the hot sun for 5 hours, for 10 hours. That is chaos. Chaos is purging eligible voters from voter rolls and modern-day poll taxes and one ballot box for a county of 5 million people, which is exactly what they did in Harris County, Texas. That is exactly what is happening in that state right now. Chaos is voters in Wisconsin waiting in line to vote for hours in the rain in their homemade masks and plastic garbage bags. The angry mob on January 6th that came into this very chamber, that spray painted the columns, that attacked police officers, that injured people left and right, that is chaos. As I said from the stage on Inauguration Day, under that bright blue sky, where you could still see the spray paint at the bottom of those columns and the makeshift windows we had in place, I said this: this is the day our democracy picks itself up, brushes off the dust, and does what America always does, goes forward as a nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Well, we cannot do that if Americans are disenfranchised, if they are not part of our democracy. Republicans have sadly made it clear that this is not legislation they are willing to negotiate or even debate. They won't even give it a week. They won't even give it a few days. Just last week, they held a press conference to tell the American people that they don't believe Congress should act to protect the right to vote or get rid of secret money in our elections. So, honestly, I would love to get some support from the other side of the aisle, but we have to be honest. I don't expect we're going to get it. So my Republican colleagues, this is not the end of the line for this bill. This is not the end of the line. This is only the beginning. Because if you have your way, those voters won't just be at the end of the line. They're not going to be able to vote. In the Rules Committee, we will be holding a series of hearings, not just one hearing, a series of hearings, and we are taking it on the road for the first time in a long time. We are going to Georgia and holding a field hearing there so we can hear firsthand from people in the state on what is happening and why we must carry out the constitutional duty in this chamber to act. And I urge my Republican colleagues to recognize the work being done in states to restrict the freedom of Americans to exercise their sacred right to vote. Our nation was founded on the ideals of democracy, and we've seen for ourselves in this building how we can never take it for granted. We can't let state legislators get to pick and choose who votes and what votes get counted. That's not how a democracy works. I urge all of my colleagues to do what the American people are asking us to do and to do what is right. Vote today to bring us closer to passing legislation to strengthen our democracy. We can't wait in line, and we can't make the people of America wait in line. The time to do this is now. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Majority Leader.
And first, let me thank so many of my colleagues, including our Chair of Rules, the Senator from Minnesota, our lead sponsor on this bill, Senator Merkley, and so many others who have done so much on this legislation. Now, what makes a democracy a democracy? It's the right of citizens to choose their own leader, to forge their own destiny, rather than have it decided for them. The right to vote. The right that generations of Americans have marched and protested to achieve. Women who reached for the ballot and marchers who were bloodied on a bridge in Selma. The right that generations of American soldiers fought and died to defend, buried now in patriot graves from Normandy to Gettysburg. And right now it is a fact, that voting rights are under assault in America in a way that we have not seen in many, many decades. Republican state legislators are limiting polling hours, locations, and ballot drop boxes, raising new ID barriers for students, making it a crime to give food and water to voters in line, and in states like Texas, trying to move Sunday voting hours so it's harder for black churchgoers to go to the polls after services. It's the most sweeping voter suppression effort in at least 80 years. targeting all the ways that historically disenfranchised voters, black and brown Americans, students, the working poor, access the ballot. We can disagree about solutions to this problem, about which policies might be more effective, but we should all agree this is a problem. We should all agree that protecting voting rights is worthy of debate. And that's what this next vote is about. Should the United States Senate even debate how to protect the voting rights of our citizens? The story of American democracy is full of contradictions and halting progress. At the time of our Constitution's ratification, you had to be, in most states, a white, male, Protestant landowner to vote. How many in this chamber, how many of us would have been able to participate in those first elections? The truth is, many of us, particularly on our side of the aisle, would not have been able to vote. But ever since the early days of the Republic, Americans launched mighty movements, fought a bloody civil war, and yes, passed federal election laws to expand the franchise until there were no more boundaries. Are we going to backslide here in the 21st century? Are we going to let reactionary state legislatures drag us back into the muck of voter suppression? Are we going to let the most dishonest president in history continue to poison our democracy from the inside? Or will we stand up to defend what generations of Americans have organized, marched, fought, and died for, the sacred, sacred right to vote? The thing that makes a democracy a democracy. I plead with my Republican colleagues. Stand up, my Republican colleagues. Stand up to a man who has lied. We all know he has lied. You know he has lied about our elections. Do not let this man lead you around by the nose and do permanent damage to our democracy. At least have the decency and honor to let this chamber debate. I urge my colleagues to vote yes and ask I yield the floor.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 77 S 2093, a bill to expand Americans' access to the ballot box, reduce the influence of big money in politics, strengthen ethics rules for public servants, and implement other anti-corruption measures for the purpose of fortifying our democracy, and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed on S 2093, a bill to expand Americans' access to the ballot box, reduce the influence of big money in politics, strengthen ethics rules for public servants, and implement other anti-corruption measures for the purpose of fortifying our democracy, and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Markley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Bennett, Booker, Brown, Cardin, Carper, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Kelly, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Manchin, Merkley, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Schatz, Schumer, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Blunt, Burr, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Daines, Ernst, Fisher, Grassley, Hawley, Hyde-Smith, Kennedy, Marshall, McConnell, Paul, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott of South Carolina, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Tuberville. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. Cornyn, no. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Warnock, aye. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Markey, aye. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Sanders, aye. Ms. Lummis, Ms. Lummis. No. Ms. Collins, Ms. Collins. No. Mr. Young, Mr. Young. No. Mr. Romney, Mr. Romney. No. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Portman. No. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Graham, no. Ms. Rosen, aye. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Lujan, aye. Mr. Haggerty, no. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Inhofe, no.
On this vote, the yeas are 50, the nays are 50. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative, the motion is not agreed to.
Madam President.
Mr. Majority Leader.
Madam President, I want to be clear about what just happened on the Senate floor. Every single Senate Republican just voted against starting debate on legislation to protect Americans' voting rights. Once again, the Senate Republican minority has launched a partisan blockade of a pressing issue here in the United States Senate, an issue no less fundamental than the right to vote. Could we have order, Madam President?
The Senate will be in order.
I've laid out the facts for weeks. Republican state legislatures across the country are engaged in the most sweeping voter suppression in 80 years, capitalizing on and catalyzed by Donald Trump's big lie. These state governments are making it harder for younger, poorer, urban, and non-white Americans to vote. Earlier today, the Republican leader told reporters that, quote, regardless of what may be happening in some states, there's no rationale for federal intervention. The Republican leader flatly stated that no matter what the states do to undermine our democracy, voter suppression laws, phony audits, partisan takeovers of local election boards, the Senate should not act. My colleagues, if senators 60 years ago held that the federal government should never intervene to protect voting rights, this body would have never passed the Voting Rights Act. The Republican leader uses the language and the logic of the Southern senators in the 60s who defended states' rights, and it is an indefensible position for any senator, let alone the minority leader, to hold. And yet that was the reason given for why Republicans voted in lockstep today. Regardless of what may be happening in some states, there's no rationale for federal intervention. That is both ridiculous and awful. All we wanted to do here on the floor was to bring up the issue of voting rights and debate how to combat these vicious, oftentimes discriminatory voting restrictions. And today, every single Democratic senator stood together in the fight to protect the right to vote in America. The Democratic Party in the Senate will always stand united to defend our democracy. I spoke with President Biden earlier this afternoon as well. He has been unshakable in his support of S1, and I want to thank the President and the Vice President for their efforts. But regrettably, our efforts were met by the unanimous opposition of the Senate minority. Once again, Senate Republicans have signed their names in the ledger of history alongside Donald Trump, the big lie, and voter suppression, to their enduring disgrace. This vote, I'm ashamed to say, is further evidence that voter suppression has become part of the official platform of the Republican Party. Now, Republican senators may have prevented us from having a debate on voting rights today. But I want to be very clear about one thing. The fight to protect voting rights is not over, by no means. In the fight for voting rights, this vote was the starting gun, not the finish line. Let me say that again. In the fight for voting rights, this vote was the starting gun, not the finish line. As many have noted, including my friend, Senator Warnock, this morning, when John Lewis was about to cross that bridge in Selma, he didn't know what waited for him on the other side. He didn't know how long his march would be, and his ultimate success was never guaranteed. But he started down that bridge anyway. Today, Democrats started our march to defend the voting rights of all Americans. It could be a long march, but it's one we are going to make. Today, we made progress. For the first time in this Congress, we got all 50 Democrats unified behind moving forward on a strong and comprehensive voting rights bill. And make no mistake about it, it will not be the last time that voting rights comes up for a debate in the Senate. Republicans may want to avoid the topic, hoping that their party's efforts to suppress votes and defend the big lie will go unnoticed. Democrats will not allow that. Democrats will never let this voter suppression be swept under the rug. We have several serious options for how to reconsider this issue and advance legislation to combat voter suppression. We are going to explore every last one of our options. We have to. Voting rights are too important, too fundamental. This concerns the very core of our democracy and what we are about as a nation. So we will not let it go. We will not let it die. This voter suppression cannot stand, and we are going to work tirelessly to see that it does not stand. I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
President. The senator from Rhode Island is recognized.
Mr. President, may I ask unanimous consent that the pending quorum call be vitiated?
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'm delighted to follow the Majority Leader in his strong remarks about the beginning of the process of passing S1, not only to deal with the question of voting rights, but to deal with the question of the dark money plague that is infesting our democracy and taking the power over decision-making in this body and in this building away from regular people and putting it into the hands not only of special interests, but of special interests who are happy to operate in secret. One of the ways in which this power has been deployed has been with respect to the judicial branch of government. And I am here now for my third speech in the scheme series to draw attention to this problem. In the first two scheme speeches, I described the corporate power game plan offered by lawyer Lewis Powell to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the subsequent effectuation of that game plan by Justice Lewis Powell, appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court 2 months after his secret corporate power game plan went to the chamber. The execution of the Powell plan was one of 3 converging threads that led to the scheme to capture the court. The Powell plan, thread 1, was a political response recommended for America's traditional corporate elite, which had been traumatized by the social upheaval of the 1960s. The second thread, thread 2, was a separate strain of American ire that had been simmering on our society's fringe for many decades. The extremists on this simmering fringe were traumatized by things long accepted as mainstream by most Americans. The fringe resentments shifted with the varying tides of news and events, but regularly boiled over against several targets. One was the role of Jewish people in finance, the press, Hollywood, and after FDR, in government. Another was the improving economic and social condition of minorities. Another was the arrival of immigrants, particularly non-European immigrants, but backlash to immigration from Ireland and Italy had been profound, as my home state experienced back under the Know-Nothings. Other resentments sprang from imaginary events, conspiracy theory, delusions, and crackpot ideas. This persistent strain along the American fringe was chronicled in Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Richard Hofstadter's 1964 essay, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, later a popular book. This latent strain of paranoid extremism showed itself in groups like the John Birch Society, which never gained social or political acceptance. It was fed and nurtured by a handful of right-wing foundations set up by a few colossally rich and politically irate and frustrated families. It boiled up in the presidential campaign of Senator Barry Goldwater, which ended in one of the worst landslide defeats in American history. It drove the occasional aspirations of the Libertarian Party, whose extremist platform suffered predictable but humiliating crushings at the polls. All of this defeat over all of these decades concentrated the strain, isolated its most persistent and determined elements, and added to it an emotional payload of resentment. One target of this fringe was the existence of government regulation. The Libertarian Party in 1980 ran on a platform of ending Social Security, ending Medicare, closing the post office, undoing the American highway program, stopping public education, and eliminating all our public regulatory agencies, even the Federal Aviation Administration that keeps planes from bumping into each other. This platform barely attracted 1% of the vote, an unsurprising but humiliating crushing. That humiliating crushing was suffered by David Koch, Libertarian Party candidate for vice president and the party's major funder. The Koch family is spectacularly, unimaginably rich. Privately held Koch Industries pours hundreds of millions of dollars into their pockets every year. The family annual income exceeds most families' dreams of lifetime wealth. The Kochs have social ambition putting their names on educational TV programs, art centers, and university buildings. They are not the sort of people who take humiliation well. They are also not stupid, and the family has long and sometimes dark international experience, including odious efforts in previous decades to build factories for evil regimes. Made confident by the arrogance of wealth, driven by extremist ideology, spurred by the resentment of humiliating political rejection, experienced in the devious ways of the international world, steeped in the corporate skills of long-term planning and patient execution, and with unlimited resources to indulge themselves, the Koch brothers, Charles and David, were uniquely positioned to take this long-standing, latent, extremist fringe and amplify it and direct it by plan, in secret, and over decades if need be. If front groups needed to be set up, so be it. Subsidiaries were a familiar concept. If identities needed to be laundered off money they gave, so be it. Telling lawyers to find or design a way to do that was familiar. If fringe groups needed to be coordinated to work collectively with each other, so be it. Organizing with others through trade associations and lobbying groups was familiar activity. And if money needed to be spent, well, so be it. Money was no object. And getting people to do things for you for money is a familiar practice of the very rich. The nurture and guidance of the Kochs breathed new strength and life and deregulatory purpose into the nativist far-right fringe. Meanwhile, in the regulatory arena, waited the third of the three threads. Major corporate interests, from the railroads first to banks, chemical companies, and polluting industries, had assembled over time a quietly powerful presence to help them in administrative agencies, to assure that regulation was friendly to business, and even more than that, under the right circumstances, with the right people and pressures, could be turned to advantage of the regulated industry. In administrative hearings and rulemakings, regulated industries regularly outgunned public interest groups. Law firms dedicated to this lucrative corporate regulatory practice sprouted. Gleaming stables were kept of well-tended professional witnesses who could reliably spout the corporate line in agency proceedings. Companies played the long game in these regulatory agencies, accreting minor victories, step by step, inch by inch, that together summed up to major gains. Many of these gains were deeply buried in the weeds of arcane policy and technical detail, inscrutable to the general media, and so invisible to the general public. Revolving doors spun between regulatory commissions and industry, so that agency decision makers often reflected the values, priorities, and interests of the regulated industry, not the general public. At the extreme, the regulatory agency became servant to the industry master, a phenomenon well known and well documented as regulatory capture. I wrote a separate book on this, Captured, so I won't dwell on it at great length here. It's enough to note that regulatory capture is so common that it has been a robust field of academic research and writing now for decades, both in economics and in administrative law. So these three socioeconomic strands converged. America's regular corporate elite took up the Powell Memo strategy of emboldened political engagement, seeking to reclaim their power and restrain the unwelcome changes roiling American society. The extremists of great wealth brought to the right-wing fringe and its motley array of extremist groups an unprecedented strategic discipline, unlimited resources, and the tactics of hard-edged corporate organization. The regulatory capture apparatus was there for the hiring, eager to pursue the new prospects offered by big industries and eccentric billionaires. Out of this slumgullion of immense wealth, extreme political ambition, and expertise at regulatory capture, how long would it take for people to start thinking about capturing not just regulatory agencies, but courts? Indeed, the United States Supreme Court. As it turned out, not long. The court had made itself a target of the right wing. Brown versus Board of Education provoked massive resistance across the South, out to defend segregated public schools. Roe versus Wade provoked, as it still provokes, the religious right. So did Engel v. Vitale, restricting prayer in schools. Griswold v. Connecticut offended those upset by the 60s sexual revolution. Miranda v. Arizona, Mapp v. Ohio, and Gideon v. Wainwright offended the tough on crime crowd. To the far right, the Supreme Court offered a bounty of things to hate. Even without the Powell Memo's corporate plan of, and I quote, exploiting judicial action, quote, with an activist-minded Supreme Court, the court would likely have been an irresistible target. But with that plan and that recommendation, it began to come together. And so the scheme was launched, fed by three political tributaries. One, the corporate plan in Lewis Powell's memo to the chamber. Two, the resurgent Koch-powered far-right fringe. And three, the eager, available mercenaries of regulatory capture. Mr. President, the effort to capture the court has likely been the most effectual deployment of right-wing and corporate resources into our common American political life. And America is now a very different place as a result of it. Much of it, like the proverbial frog in the proverbial pot, we've even gotten used to. And we accept it now as normal when it isn't. To be continued. I yield the floor. And I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President,
Senator from Texas.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to celebrate a win for the country. Today, the United States rightly failed to advance the Corrupt Politicians Act, meaning that this bill will not come to the Senate floor for a final vote. This is a huge win for the citizens of the United States. This is a huge win for democracy, and it's a huge win for the integrity of our elections. The Corrupt Politicians Act is the most dangerous legislation we've considered in the Senate in the 9 years I've served in this body. It's an attempt by Senate Democrats at a brazen power grab. It's an attempt by Democrats to federalize elections and to ensure that Democrats won't lose control for the next 100 years. This bill isn't about protecting the right to vote. It's precisely the opposite. It's about taking away the right to vote from the citizens and giving it instead to the corrupt politicians in Washington who want to stay in power. The Corrupt Politicians Act would strike down virtually every common sense voter integrity law adopted by states across the country. 36 states have adopted voter ID laws, a reasonable and common sense step to protect the integrity of elections that over 70% of Americans support and over 60% of African Americans support. In fact, recent polling now shows support for voter ID at over 80%, thanks no doubt to the relentless assault on voter ID mounted by Senate Democrats. The Corrupt Politicians Act would repeal the vast majority of these voter ID laws. Likewise, 31 states prohibit ballot harvesting, the corrupt practice of paying political operatives to collect other people's ballots. So what would the Corrupt Politicians Act do? It would strike down all of those laws in 31 states and would mandate ballot harvesting nationwide. It would mean that paid political operatives from the Democratic National Committee could go to nursing homes and collect votes, some of those votes, no doubt, from individuals who may be no longer competent to make a decision. And the reason 31 states have acted to ban ballot harvesting is it invites voter fraud. An unscrupulous operative can fill out the ballot for a senior citizen who no longer has the capacity to make a decision. And if that senior citizen has the temerity to vote in a way the operative doesn't like, there's nothing to prevent the operative from throwing that ballot in the mail and simply not sending it in, only sending in the ballots that happen to comply with their own political preference. If you care even one whit about election integrity, striking down every prohibition on ballot harvesting is precisely the wrong step to take. The Corrupt Politician Act would also automatically register to vote anyone who comes in contact with the government. So if you get a welfare check, if you get an unemployment check, if you have a driver's license, if you go to a state college or state university, you're automatically registered to vote. Well, what's the problem with that? The problem with that, as the authors of the bill know, is that would register millions of illegal aliens to vote. Millions of illegal aliens come into contact with the government, and automatic registration is designed to register millions of illegal aliens. How do we know this? We know this, among other things, because the bill explicitly immunizes the state officials who would be registering illegal aliens to vote. It grants a safe harbor and says when you illegally register illegal aliens, you'll have no liability. If you care about the integrity of elections, registering millions of illegal aliens to dilute and steal the votes of legal American citizens is exactly the opposite way to go. Not only that, many states have reasonable restrictions on felons and on criminals voting. What does the Corrupt Politicians Act do? It strikes all of those down and instead mandates that all felons should be allowed to vote. Murderers, rapists, child molesters, all allowed to vote because Democrats have made the cynical calculation that if millions of illegal aliens are allowed to vote and millions of criminals and felons are allowed to vote, that those individuals are likely to vote Democrat. And Democrats want to stay in power. The bill also prevents states from correcting voter rolls and from removing people who passed away. You can't go in when someone's dead and say, you know, dead people shouldn't be voting. No, this bill mandates leave the dead people on the rolls. Another step designed to invite fraud. Moreover, the Corrupt Politicians Act is welfare for politicians. This bill is designed to give hundreds of millions of dollars every year to corrupt incumbent politicians to keep them in power. It matches, for contributions under $200, 6-to-1 federal funds, so that the members of this body would receive collectively over $1 billion in federal funds to stay in power. That's great if you're a corrupt politician who wants to prevent a challenger from ever defeating you, and if you want to prevent the voters from making a different choice, then you flood them with federal funds to make it so you can't beat corrupt incumbents. But that's not what you do if you want to protect the right to vote. This bill is brazen. It is so brazen that the joke really is admitted in one provision of the bill. The Federal Elections Commission was created in the wake of Watergate, designed to protect integrity in our elections. It was, from the beginning, designed to be bipartisan. 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. Because Congress recognized that a partisan Federal Elections Commission would be deeply injurious to our democracy. That to have a Federal Election Commission with any integrity, it needed to be bipartisan, which means you needed a bipartisan majority to act in order to ensure that neither party weaponizes the federal election laws. What does the Corrupt Politicians Act do? Turns the Federal Election Commission into a partisan body. Shifts it from 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats to 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. It turns it into an arm of the Democratic Senate committee in effect. Nothing in this bill is as cynical as that provision. We're in a 50-50 Senate. We have close elections in this race. Mr. President, you're a sophisticated political player. I want you to ask for a second. In a close election, in the weeks before the election, if the Senate Majority Leader had the ability to launch investigations from the Federal Election Commission, to bring prosecutions from the Federal Elections Commission to sue the political opponents of the majority, how much would that invite abuse? I understand right now Democrats are in power of both houses of Congress and the White House. Power can be intoxicating. But I do want to point out it wasn't that long ago. Mr. President, you and I were both in this body 4 years ago when there was a Republican president and a Republican House and a Republican Senate. You didn't see the Republican majority try anything as brazen as the Corrupt Politicians Act. You didn't see a Republican majority trying to rig the game, trying to change the rules so that Republicans could never be defeated in the next election. You didn't see the Republican majority trying to turn the Federal Election Commission into a partisan weapon. I ask you, Mr. President, what level of comfort would you have as an elected Democrat if Mitch McConnell had control of the Federal Election Commission? If it were a Republican partisan agency? I think you would be entirely justified in being concerned that it would be used as a political weapon to hurt you. Your last election was a relatively close election. Imagine 2 weeks before the election if a Republican Federal Election Commission announced sweeping investigation into massive campaign finance violations by the incumbent senator who happened to be of the party that was out of power. You would rightly feel that was grotesquely unfair. And yet that's what every Senate Democrat just voted to create. You know, the most pernicious aspect of this bill has been the racial demagoguery that it has invited. We've heard the Senate Majority Leader invoke in booming terms specters from our sorry history of racial discrimination in the past. The Senate Majority Leader has used the phrase Jim Crow 2.0 repeatedly, as has the President of the United States, as has the Vice President of the United States, deliberately inflaming racial tensions, suggesting that laws, common sense voter integrity laws in states like Georgia and Texas, things like requiring voter ID or requiring signature verification on absentee ballots, are somehow a modern manifestation of Jim Crow. That is a grotesque lie. And Mr. President, the Majority Leader knows that. The President of the United States knows that. The Vice President of the United States, they know they're lying. But ironically, they've inadvertently said something that is accurate about this piece of legislation. Jim Crow legislation was grotesque and ugly. It was legislation that was drafted without exception by Democratic politicians. Jim Crow was written by Democratic politicians. And its purpose when the Jim Crow laws were written were to prevent the voters from ever voting out of office Democratic politicians. It's one of the ugliest chapters of our nation's history. And thankfully, we repudiated Jim Crow. Well, the Majority Leader used the phrase Jim Crow 2.0, and inadvertently he's right, but not about what he's describing. He's right about the Corrupt Politicians Act. The Corrupt Politicians Act follows the exact same pattern that Jim Crow did. It is partisan legislation written by elected Democrats designed to keep elected Democrats in office and to steal the right to vote from the citizenry to decide on somebody else. Democracy is too important for that. And the kind of cynical racial demagoguery that we have seen around this bill, while ignoring the substance of it, and I will point out the media has been eager to ignore the substance of it. The media says, should we protect the right to vote? Yes, we should protect the right to vote. This bill takes away your right to vote. This bill is designed to prevent the voters from choosing to throw the bums out. The most fundamental right of any voter to throw the bums out, whether they're one side or the other side. We, the people, have sovereignty. And this bill, the Corrupt Politicians Act, was designed to take that power from the people and give it to the politicians in Washington. So today was a victory. It was a victory for the American people. It was a victory for democracy. It was a victory for the Constitution, and it was a victory for the rule of law. I yield the floor.
Madam President,
The senator from New York.
I rise today for the 13th time to call for every senator to have the opportunity to vote on a common sense, bipartisan bill, the Military Justice Improvement and Increasing Prevention Act. This bill would ensure that members of our military would get the justice and the justice system that their sacrifices deserve. We do not have time to delay. I've begun calling for a floor vote on this bill since May 24th. That's 29 days ago. Since then, it's estimated that 1,624 service members will have been raped or sexually assaulted. More will have been victims of other serious crimes, and many of them will feel that there's no point in even reporting the crime because they have no faith in the current military justice system. That's because right now, if a service member reports a crime, the case and their fate will be put into a commander's hand. This bill argues instead that our service members who are victims of serious crimes or who are accused of serious crimes should have those cases reviewed by an impartial, trained military prosecutor. And it does not say the commanders are removed from their responsibility with regard to the military justice system. It doesn't say the commanders are relieved of the responsibility of ensuring good order and discipline. Under this bill, commanders will still have the full array of tools to implement good order and discipline: counseling, restriction, confinement, protective orders, rank reduction, non-judicial punishment, summary court-martial, and even special court-martial. None of these change under the law. In addition, under today's system, only 3% of commanders have the right to do convening authority for general court-martials. So the truth is that a small number of commanders will be even affected by this legislation. But I can promise you, the view from the service members will be significant, because they will now see that if there are someone who has been assaulted or harassed or had any justice need, that the person reviewing the case would be highly trained and unbiased. And if you're a black or brown service member who's disproportionately punished under the current system, you would know that the decision maker was impartial, unbiased, and highly trained. This change is something that will help for both victims of sexual assault, but also for defendants' rights. For serious crimes, we need both pieces of this puzzle, and this bill provides both. It will still allow commanders to take the administrative steps to send a message to their troops about what is or is not tolerated. And 97% of them have to do that every day without having convening authority for general court-martial. And it will allow for victims and their families to get real justice. The Military Justice Improvement and Prevention Act will deliver the results that our service members and their families deserve without compromising command authority. That is what our allies have said. UK, Germany, Israel, Australia, Netherlands, Canada have all testified to our body in various hearings and various committees that they saw no diminution in command control and no diminution in the ability to prepare and train troops. The truth is, if this is a reform whose time has come, and every minute we delay, we are not standing by our service members. It is a change that has been supported by veterans groups across the country, whether it's the Iraq and Afghanistan Association of Veterans, whether it's the Vietnam Veterans Association, whether it's the Foreign Legion or the Veterans of Foreign Wars. Military veterans support this bill. This is a change whose time has come, and I request that we have a floor vote to decide this. 66 senators on a bipartisan basis support this. The committee has been addressing this issue for 8 years. We've already passed 250 smaller reforms, none of which has had a dent on the problem. It's time to do the reform that survivors have asked for and that veterans organizations support. I ask unanimous consent at a time to be determined by the majority leader in consultation with the Republican leader, the Senate Armed Services Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-1520 and the Senate proceed to its consideration, that there be 2 hours for debate equally divided in the usual form, and that upon the use or yielding back of that time, the Senate vote on the bill with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Madam President.
The senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Madam President. And let me thank my colleague from New York for her work to move this issue forward. But once again, I would object to the request for the reasons I've previously stated. And in addition, Madam President, today the ranking member of the committee, Senator Inhofe, released the written views of each member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which he had requested on Senator Gillibrand's proposed legislation. I understand that some in our body might discount these views of senior military leadership, and that's their prerogative. But I do believe it's important that their voices be part of the public discourse. They have dedicated their life to the service of this nation. They have led troops in combat. They have experienced all of the issues that face commanders, face subordinates. They have a unique, I think, position within the system. And in addition, the military will have to implement whatever system Congress devises, and it will require their expertise and skill. As such, I would like to enter these records into the record and ask unanimous consent to do so.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Now, I won't quote from these letters at length now, but I would just point out that the chiefs are open-minded about changing the way we prosecute sexual assault and harassment within the ranks. So am I. In fact, I think that is something that I hope becomes clear in our progress legislatively moving forward. But they nevertheless stress the importance of ensuring that any change Congress enacts must be carefully tailored to address the problems we are trying to solve. And the critical problem we are trying to solve is sexual assault, sexual harassment, any kind of crime connected to sexual misconduct. And in addition, that adequate time and resources must be afforded for implementing any of the changes that we propose. The nature and the magnitude of the change we are contemplating here is complex. We have to make sure we do this right. Further, we've heard over the past few years from the leadership of the Military Services Judge Advocate General's Corps, who have uniformly opposed these changes in nature and scope. And these are the military lawyers, the very military justice experts to whom this bill would invest authority currently reserved to commanders. And I believe we should listen to them as well, move prudently and deliberately to address the problem at hand. So, as I've said a number of times already, I intend to include the administration's recommendations that derive from the President's Independent Review Commission in the markup of the defense bill, subject to amendment, not to move a bill on the floor without the chance of my colleagues in the committee to have their voices heard. These ladies and gentlemen have dedicated themselves to military policy for many years. They are experts in different dimensions of this issue, and they will add, I think, significantly. To simply take a bill and send it to the floor without amendments, I think is not the way to proceed. I anticipate a bill that will be strengthened through debate and discussion and deliberation by the committee. And with that, Madam President, I would reiterate my objection to Senator Gillibrand's request.
Madam President.
The objection is heard.
Madam President.
Senator from New York.
I disagree with the chairman because the service chiefs and commanders for the last 8 years have objected to any serious reform. And in fact, what they've said time and time again, trust us, we'll get this right, and have objected to any major reform. And in fact, that's what they did any time we tried to reform the military. They objected on the same basis, using the same words, when we tried to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. They objected in the same way when we tried to allow women to get credit for being in combat. They objected in the same way when we integrated the military. And so to hear these objections over and over again after the committee has studied this issue for 8 years and allowed 250 reforms to be put into the NDAA, all of which were okay by the DOD, just flies in the face of reality. The military has demanded sole responsibility of these cases for the 8 years that I've worked on this issue, and have they dented the problem? No. Sexual assaults were estimated at 20,000 by the military last they counted. Has the rate of cases going to trial increased? No. Has the rate of cases that have ended in conviction increased? No. So under no measurable has the DOD got a handle on this. And for the chairman to say it has to go through the committee, this issue has been going through the committee for 8 years. And in fact, when I've passed bipartisan reform with people like Senator Joni Ernst on the safe to report language, it was taken out in conference by the same DOD staff that didn't want it in there in the first place. So under the chairman's view, this bill could certainly go through committee. We have more than half of the members, but I promise you it will be watered down or taken out in conference because the chairman and the ranking member are against it, and they have the authority to do so. So he is not offering a fair process. The fact that this bill has 66 co-sponsors, how many bills in America in this body have the support of Ted Cruz and Liz Warren, of Mitch McConnell and Senator Schumer? None. This is the kind of bipartisan bill that this country is yearning for, the kind of common sense reform that can protect service members. And while the chairman is so interested in supporting what the generals and the admirals and the top commanders want, why does not he listen to the service members themselves, to the people who have suffered sexual assault, to the people who have suffered racial bias in prosecution? Those are the people that he should be listening to, not the top brass. We've deferred to them the entire 10 years I've been on this committee, and in the entire 10 years, our committee has failed. It is time to bring this bill to the floor. I yield the floor.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Madam President.
Senator from Maryland.
Madam President, I ask that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Just a short time ago, on this Senate floor, we witnessed a low point for this body. We witnessed every Republican senator voting against moving forward to consider legislation to strengthen our democracy. We witnessed all 50 Republican senators voting to block consideration of the For the People Act. I don't know why people are afraid of debating this issue, which is so fundamental to our country at this particular point in time. This bill, the For the People Act, has many important provisions. One of them, of course, is to establish minimum national standards to make sure that every eligible American voter can access the ballot box. That should be something we all want. We should want every American eligible to vote to be out there exercising his or her right to vote, to participate in the decision-making in our democracy. And yet, not a single Republican senator voted to proceed with that debate. Even though this bill is more important now than ever before, because we see, as we speak, Republican state legislators in so many places around our country voting to erect barriers to the ballot box. We see this in state after state, a pure partisan power play to rig the rules, to win elections by subtraction. Not to win elections through the hurly-burly debate over issues of our day, not to win elections by talking about the agenda that somebody is advocating and why someone should vote for a particular candidate. That's the way it's supposed to be, but these are legislatures that are putting up barriers to make it harder for people to access the ballot, and specifically designing these barriers to try to limit participation by people of color and by younger voters. We saw that even before the aftermath of this election. We saw it in the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision in Shelby v. Holder. We saw Texas and North Carolina and other states adopting these kind of restrictive voting laws. Don't have to take my word for it. The U.S. courts took a look at the North Carolina law that was passed a number of years ago and said that they targeted African American voters with, quote, surgical precision to try to keep them from accessing the voting booth. And that's exactly the kind of thing that's going on now in state after state around the country. Trying to win not by the great addition and multiplication of democracy, but by subtraction and by division. And so, why are these states doing this at this moment? They're doing it because of the big lie that was perpetrated in the aftermath of our presidential election. A lie that the former president persists in spewing and repeating to this very moment. The lie that he was somehow cheated or robbed out of an election. The lie that led to the attack on this Capitol on January 6th. It's that lie that is giving rise to these actions in state legislatures. It's that lie that sadly led this body just a short while ago to block consideration of a bill to establish a commission to look at what happened on January 6th. That bill, too, was filibustered, just like this one. in order to prevent the American people from getting to the bottom of the big lie. Republican senators blocked that too. They don't want the country to know. And they apparently are perfectly happy to allow all these state legislatures to put up barriers to voting as part of that big lie narrative. And we know it's a big lie for so many reasons. Of course, President Trump and his campaign took their claims to courts throughout the country. Over 60 courts said those are ridiculous claims. President Trump's own Justice Department, his Attorney General, former Attorney General Barr, before he stepped down, said there was no wrongdoing in this election that would change any kind of outcome. The president's point person at the Department of Homeland Security, responsible for monitoring the integrity of elections, has testified before Congress and said very clearly that the 2020 presidential election was the most secure election in American history. Most secure in American history. That's from the person in charge of election integrity in President Trump's own administration. And so why are all these states enacting these barriers to voting after an election that the Trump Homeland Security Department said was the most secure in history? It's because so many people turned out and voted in that secure election, and they didn't like the outcome. So when you don't like the outcome in election, instead of taking your case to the American people and saying that vote for us next time because here's our agenda for the country, here's what we're going to do, instead they decided that they're going to try to win by putting up barriers to try to prevent those large turnouts, especially among people of color, and we saw younger voters come out in 2020. So the decision to block this bill from debate is just a continuation of protecting the big lie. It's a continuation of protecting the big lie that is being fueled around the country by Donald Trump's continuous fraudulent claims, which unfortunately have seized the Republican Party. We saw what happened in the House of Representatives. Liz Cheney, a stalwart conservative, ousted from her leadership position because she didn't pay homage to the former president. That's what's going on here. That's what's going on in the House, and that is what's reflected in this vote today. The refusal to even debate a bill to strengthen our democracy. Come to the floor. Tell us what you don't like. Tell us what you want to do. Ask, do you really believe that what these state legislatures are doing is a good thing for our democracy? I know it's easier not to have to talk about that. Easier to ignore it all. But we're not going to let this issue go away. We're going to be here week after week to make sure that we continue to push this For the People Act. Now, in addition to the provisions to establish minimal protections so every eligible voter can access the voting booth, the For the People Act also has a number of other very important provisions that are overwhelmingly popular with the American people. One of them is the incorporation of what's known as the Disclose Act. The Disclose Act does a very simple thing. It gets rid of secret corporate money being plowed into our elections through these secret super PACs. You know, what happened after the decision in Citizens United were two things. One, corporate money now could flow in unlimited amounts into elections. But the Supreme Court at the time said, you can at least be aware of who's spending all this money if you pass laws to make sure it's transparent. In fact, a lot of the justices who voted to overturn the Citizens United, voted to allow corporate money in politics, who were in the majority in Citizens United, also said in that same opinion that they essentially expected Congress to enact laws to ensure transparency. In fact, 8 of the 9 Supreme Court justices in that case took that position. And yet, the Republican leader who in the early 2000s called for more transparency when it came to money being spent in elections is taking the opposite idea. We don't want the public to know who is spending all that money. We want it to be secret. I think most of us would agree, and I know the American public agrees, that they have a right to know who is spending millions and millions of dollars to try to influence their votes. We know that because survey after survey shows that Republicans, Democrats, and independents all agree that they should know who is spending all of this dark money. When you see a TV commercial that says, paid for by the Committee for America, you should know who is financing that ad to try to influence your vote. It's a very simple principle. Voters have a right to know. It was a principle agreed to by, conservative jurists like Justice Scalia. And yet, the position of the Republican senators today was, we don't even want to talk about that. We don't even want to debate that provision. By the way, that provision, the Disclose Act, passed the House back in 2010. And it came here to the United States Senate. And the Senate version of the Disclose Act was debated on this Senate floor. 59 senators at that time voted to proceed with the bill. You might say 59 senators, that's a majority. Why didn't it pass? Because of the filibuster rule. They needed 60. 59 senators said, we want disclosure. 59 senators said, get rid of secret money. But because of the filibuster rule, it didn't pass. It couldn't get to final passage on a simple majority. If that had passed back in 2010, we wouldn't have our airwaves flooded with secret money today. We would have done what the American people wanted. The Disclose Act is in this bill now. And once again, 11 years later, Republican senators are filibustering the bill for the Disclose Act. They don't want the American people to know who is spending all of that money, mostly corporate money, flowing underground, under the radar screen, through our political system to try to elect candidates of the choice of whatever special interests are spending that money. But they don't want you to know who they are, who's spending all that money to elect people. So why don't we all agree we're going to get rid of secret money? Apparently, we don't even want to debate that. Another provision that is universally popular with the American people is the idea that we should have nationwide, nonpartisan congressional districting. Let's draw congressional districts not based on politics, but based on some nonpartisan criteria. I think we've all heard the line that it should not be the case that politicians are picking the voters. Voters should pick their elected officials. These days, people can draw congressional districts maps with incredible precision with the use of computers and literally try and draw a congressional district designed to get exactly the electorate they want. I don't think that's the way the founders expected it to end up working. to get a computer that could draw these districts with that kind of precision accuracy. And so one of the other important provisions in the For the People Act is let's draw congressional districts so that we, the people, can make these decisions without the lines having been drawn to predetermine the outcome. That's also in this bill. It also has some other important provisions that I support to try to reduce the impact and influence of big money contributors, to allow people with lesser means to be able to contribute to elections and have some element of public financing so that the system is more geared toward the public interest than relying exclusively on the private big contributions. That's another provision that's in the For the People Act. Some people may disagree with that. Come to the floor, debate it, offer an amendment to get rid of it. Let's vote. But what we saw today was a refusal to engage in the democratic process of debate and consideration of a bill. They used this provision, the filibuster provision, to block a bill to help protect and strengthen our democracy. And that is a sad and shameful day in the United States Senate. But I'm going to end with this. This issue is not going away. I was glad to see that even as every Republican senator voted no, every Democratic senator united together to say we stand for the idea that we should have some minimal national standards for access to the ballot booth to protect our democracy, that we should get rid of secret money in politics. Every Democrat said, let's proceed to debate a bill that has those important provisions in it. And so we're not going away. This is a vote that may be a temporary setback, but it's my strong view that at the end of the day, democracy will prevail in the sense that it will be strengthened, and that the American people are not going to stand for a process that reinforces the big lie that was perpetrated on this country. And so the good news, as I said, is every Democratic senator said yes to moving forward, and we will find a way to get this done. We will find a way to protect our democracy. And I yield the floor. Madam President.
Senator from Maryland.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S-Res 282, which was submitted earlier today.
The clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 282, recognizing July 1, 2021 as the 100th anniversary of the Government Accountability Office, and so forth.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
Madam President, I further ask that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S-2184, introduced earlier today.
The clerk will report.
S-2184, a bill to amend the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 to institute a trading prohibition for certain issuers and so forth and for other purposes.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered, read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that at a time to be determined by the majority leader following consultation with the Republican leader, the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 74 S-1251, that the only amendments in order be the following. Lee number 2119.
Without objection.
I further ask that there be 2 hours for debate equally divided on the bill, that upon the use or yielding back of time, the Senate vote on the Lee amendment, that the bill be considered read a third time, the Senate vote on passage of the bill as amended, if amended, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination. Calendar number 115.
Without objection, the clerk will report.
Nomination, Department of Energy, Ali Nouri of the District of Columbia to be an Assistant Secretary, Congressional and Intergovernmental Affairs.
Madam President, I ask consent that the Senate vote on the nomination without intervening action or debate, and if confirmed, the motion be to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, all without intervening action or debate. That no further motions be in order to the nomination, that any statements related to the nomination be printed in the record, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate then resume legislative session.
The question is on the nomination. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The nomination is confirmed.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until 2 p.m. Wednesday, June 23rd, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed. Further, upon the conclusion of morning business, the Senate proceed to executive session to resume consideration of the Boardman nomination. Further, that if cloture is invoked on the Boardman nomination, all post-cloture time expire at 5:45 p.m. Finally, that if the nomination is confirmed, the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Madam President, if there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow.